Sky News Australia presents Senator Jim Molan, the final interview.
Okay, let's go back to the problems that have been building over time, Jim.
This is not something which has happened recently. President Xi has essentially led this. He came to power in 2012 and there was a noticeable change in China's approach to the world. Since then, he has consolidated his power internally so that he's now in his third term. In the last couple of years, really ever since COVID and our inquiry, it's become very, very obvious that Australia as an ally of the United States was a handy nation to be bullied by China. I think our government, the last government, realised that in the last couple of years, and from 2020 onwards, pledged a significant amount of money, $270 billion, but over 10 years, for defence. But still, I couldn't see an overall strategy that this played into. So I'd say that it has really been marked in the last couple of years, and I think that is why the Labor government is now changing its tune so markedly to be prudent in how it approaches defence.
The reason I put it to you like that, though, Jim, is because what do we do about the Uyghurs? What do we do about Xinjiang? Nothing. What do we do about the militarisation of the South China Sea? Nothing. What do we do about Hong Kong? Nothing. What are we going to do about Taiwan? Xi Jinping knows this too, doesn't he?
Well, yes, but the Americans can do something about Taiwan.
Will they, though?
That's the question. We're talking about two things here. We're talking about, as we look at countries that are adversaries to us from 2 points of view. We look at them from the point of view of intent, what they think they're going to do today, and capability, which is what they can do today. My complaint during estimates in 2022, during 2022 was that we don't look at our friends in the same way. We've had the President of the United States saying on a number of occasions now that he favours defending Taiwan. How he'll do it, I'm not too sure. The State Department have said other things.
Well, they got to go and mop him up.
And they change what he said. But the American military now, in their war games, believe that with their current force setup, they cannot win that war. So they're changing a lot of things, and they've now taken Congress, in fact, added a couple of $100 billion into their defence vote recently. That won't do the full trick, but it's better than nothing. The Western countries, the liberal democracies of this world, must understand that we've got to deter China from taking down a democracy, I'm not too sure how liberal it is, a democracy such as Taiwan.
But the Americans won't even put a boot in Ukraine. Why would they put a boot in Taiwan?
And maybe they don't need to put a boot in, but what they do need, they need to project power out of Japan, South Korea, Guam, and other places. They need to be able to defend their own carrier battle groups, which at the moment is dubious. They need to be able to defend their carrier battle groups as they move into the first and the second island chain. That is absolutely critical because if they can do all of that and the Chinese see it, we've got deterrence. Richard Marles talks about a massive failure of deterrence, and this is what he is trying to avoid. And we can contribute to that. Because if we leave everything up to the Americans, firstly, should the worst happen, and we want help from them at some stage. I mean, this has been 80 years of the basis of our strategic assessment is that if we do little wars with the Americans, when the big one comes along, the Americans will come and help us. At the moment, I doubt that's possible, but hopefully, give us a year or so, hopefully the Americans will see logic. Hopefully the Defence Strategic Review will start us on a track where we are powerful as a country in ourselves.
Back on the burden and the expectation that the Americans have of us, Jim.
The most basic expectation is that we share the burden, and the biggest burden is casualties. If you're going to fight beside the Americans, you will take casualties. So whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or in a future Taiwan scenario, there will be significant casualties. If you send up forces which aren't prepared to fight, the Americans know it. They know it absolutely truthfully. And they know who their allies are that are prepared to really stand shoulder to shoulder with them. And that's the key thing.
AUKUS ties us even closer to the Americans though, right? So
Yes.
again, back to that point, how do we say no then?
Well, I don't think we can say no, because I think we've already made the choice. Our weaponry is all based, our equipment is all based on American equipment. We're now part of AUKUS, we're part of ANZUS, and we have been an ally of America's for 80 years. So it's going to be hard to say no. The big question is, can we get there in time? The only country in the world that China pays any attention to, really, is the United States.
So do you believe that war in our region is inevitable?
No, I don't believe it's inevitable. I would never admit that it's inevitable, because we just should sit back and accept it if I believe that. I think that, firstly, it's possible for the simple reason that China is so aggressive, and both China and America are well and truly armed to fight a war. I think it's much more likely than most of our leaders are saying. It's interesting because an American academic recently did an analysis of the 16 occasions in the last 500 years where a rising power, such as China, overtook a dominant power, such as America. And war was the result in 12 of those 16 times. Now, that's 75% probability of war. Now, that's what we're seeing at the moment. China is determined to become the dominant power in the Western Pacific, where we live, and maybe across the whole world. It'll take them a lot longer to be dominant across the whole world.
What is the threat? How would you specify what the threat is?
I think the major threat is that we are complacent as a nation. And when I look at what worries Australians at the moment, it's cost of living. Of course I understand that. I fully understand that. But there is only one organisation in Australia that can lead us out of the day-to-day issues that Australians are dealing with to the big issues of the day, which is national security. The big threat towards us is that somehow, some way, China will challenge us as a liberal democracy. It might be in direct conflict with us. It might be in a war between us and our great and powerful friend, the Americans, with us as collateral damage to that particular war. And then, because the Americans are out of the region, we become fundamentally a tributary state to China, and we lose our liberal democratic nature. That's what we've got to defend.
Why does it want to do that?
Well, I think it sees its own place in the world. And China, throughout its thousands of years of history, has been confident in the fact that it is the most important nation in the world. It's had a couple of 100 years of bad times, but it was the centre of the known universe, and it bears a deep resentment for what the West did to it during those couple of 100 years of intimidation that we applied to them.
The Opium Wars.
They're never going to put themselves into that situation ever again.
What, so it's an ideological thing?
I think it's an ideological thing. It's strongly nationalistic. Nationalism in China, from what I read, is extraordinary. And the Chinese people are so behind President Xi that it's amazing.
So we're going to have a tough decision to make moving forward, right? On whether we want to protect our very comfortable way of life here or whether we want to get involved in that.
Correct. I don't want to be a person who has lived through the best times that Australia has ever seen, from 1950 until now, where we were a liberal democracy, our rights were looked after, we were prosperous, we were a big player in the region and a player throughout the world. It's not guaranteed that we will continue in that situation. I think if you asked a Ukrainian in say 2013 what's the most important thing, they may have said to you, cost of living is the most important thing. Nowadays, of course, in 2014, 2018 and now, these things change. I'd say to every Australian, what we take for granted in the sovereignty and freedom and prosperity of this country should never be taken for granted. I understand the day-to-day issues that Australians face, but governments must lead the Australian people, and they must lead them to understand what we have and what needs to be defended. And the only way you can do that is by putting money where the government's mouth is, and being able to assure the Australian people that we are defendable.
We're never going to be able to match the Chinese military machine, though, are we?
Never. We are woefully unprepared for a regional war in relation to the resilience of our nation. The things that worry me most are liquid fuels, of which we have very little in the country because we depend on open supply chains. We have fragility in our energy supplies to our factories and our people. We import an awful lot. It may diminish in the future, but we import an awful lot of our fertiliser. Therefore, our food production will drop, and the impact of no diesel on our on our food production is terrifying. We have only 2 refineries left in this country, and they provide no more than about 10% of the total fuel that we use in Australia. We import most of our IT, and although we do have some reserves in relation to pharmaceuticals, we import most of them as well. So if we think that the armed forces of this country are small and irrelevant, the lack of resilience in this nation, if we lose access to sea transport, is terrifying. The single point of failure in Australia are our ports.
And China owns a couple of them.
Yeah, and I'm not overly worried about that because we can take them back immediately. But if they blockaded us, if they just frightened away all the ships, they don't have to have gunboats at the entrance to Sydney Harbour. If there is a regional war going on in our part of the world, you won't get the owners of ships, and we own almost no ships at all. I totally support the Labor Party's policy to get ships into Australia, but I don't support that the Maritime Union of Australia should crew them. We own no ships of our own. Therefore, if there's conflict in our part of the world, no ships will come to Australian ports. Are we prepared, for example, for a blockade of our ports? No, we're not prepared in any way for a blockade of our ports. That could be a grey zone type of activity. Are we prepared have we built the resilience of the country so that if we lose sea imports, we can still sustain what we are? Are we prepared for a significant fight between the Americans and the Chinese in the first and second island chains? Are there other things in our region? Could we establish peace and security in the South Pacific? Could we control the straits? We might need to control the straits. Could we control the straits through Indonesia?
So they're all terrifying points. And a lot of people might think that's a bit dramatic, that's not going to happen, but you're arguing that, well, it could happen and the government needs to be honest about that and to tell the public about the potential for that to happen.
Many people find, I think, because we've fundamentally been at peace for 80 years, many people find a serious war beyond their comprehension. Ask the Ukrainians. And people have often said to me, China wouldn't be that stupid, would they? Ask the Russians. And is Australia worth fighting for? And I've made the point in the past that young Australians may not be prepared to fight for Vietnam or for Iraq or for Afghanistan, and I understand that. But I believe that the government could convince the Australian people that whatever Australia is, this extraordinary country in which we live, it could be under threat in the future, and now is the time to prepare for that threat. History is replete with examples of nations which didn't believe that an extreme scenario would happen. Why would China give us notice? Why would China only do a small thing? If China's going to achieve its strategic objectives, it's got to be a risk taker.
So what is your code red warning?
My code red warning is a surprise attack by China on American facilities in the vicinity of Taiwan, which would then mean, and that fundamentally is South Korea, Japan, Guam, Alaska and Diego Garcia. That would then mean that China fundamentally has total freedom of action in relation to the Western Pacific, because if that missile attack on those facilities, and I explain it all in my book, if that missile attack is effective, the Americans cannot reinforce those countries. The interesting thing is that exactly like in 1941 and 42, they could reinforce Australia. Now, the Chinese are no fools. They know history. They know the way the Second World War went. In the Second World War, 60% of government expenditure was on defence, and 30% of the GDP was spent on defence. We need the government not to panic the people, but to put in place what it can for an extreme scenario, as well as all the other scenarios it's got to take care of.
But if China makes any kind of attack on Americans, that's war right there, right?
Certainly is.
That's much more than a war footing. That is the beginning of war.
Yes, it is. For China to conduct a surprise missile attack on American facilities, either in American territory such as Alaska or Guam, or overseas such as Japan or South Korea or Diego Garcia, is an enormous step. But it just happens to be the kind of step which has the chance of delivering to China regional dominance plus Taiwan. Let's just think about the alternative. President Xi is saying all the time that we'll take Taiwan one way or the other, by force or by convincing them. Let's just suppose that China decides to conduct what everyone kind of thinks they'll conduct. That is a D-Day style 1944 attack across 180 kilometres of the Taiwan Strait from Fujian province into Taiwan. The Americans will see them coming for weeks, if not months. So I just don't think that flies as an option.
Right. So you think they'll neutralise the enemy, so to speak, outside of Taiwan before going into Taiwan itself?
Correct. I believe they will neutralise the Americans, dominate the Western Pacific, and say to Taiwan, okay, Japan, okay, South Korea, are you really going to fight us now that the Americans aren't behind you anymore? See, if you take out all the refuelling aircraft that are politely and beautifully parked on the aprons of all those various American airfields throughout the region, you can't reinforce the Western Pacific from the United States or from Hawaii.
We all know that China's been aggressive, and that's happened largely because of Xi Jinping rising to power. And we know that the political influence that they have tried here in Australia. We know the grey war tactics and cybersecurity breaches happen almost daily at the moment. So aren't they the main threats? So they can be identified right now, and right now we should be pushing back against all of that.
Well, and we are. We push back against the kind of threats you've just mentioned, but I don't believe that's the extreme threat. I believe that the most extreme threat is a regional war between the United States and China. What does that mean for Australia? It means missile attacks on certain facilities in this country. We know those kind of threats, and we've pushed back very, very effectively against those threats. Our government has stood up very strongly against the intimidation from China. But I don't believe that's the full extent of what's going on. People describe the current strategic environment as being an aggressive China. Well, what does that mean? An aggressive China against Russia, or against South Korea, or against us? If it is against us, what does that mean? Is it against the Americans? We've got to get down from these generalities. You cannot structure and pay for a defence force on generalities.
Don't we already know what the threats are, though?
No. If we did, why would we have a defence force of 60,000 people? I think our government, the last government, realised that in the last couple of years, and from 2020 onwards, pledged a significant amount of money, $270 billion, but over 10 years, for defence. But still, I couldn't see an overall strategy that this played into. So I'd say that it has really been marked in the last couple of years, and I think that is why the Labor government is now changing its tune so markedly to be prudent in how it approaches defence.
So how do you think Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles and Penny Wong are all handling that situation at the moment?
I think they're saying the right things, and I'm comforted by the fact that they're saying the right things. But I want to see the money. I want to see the colour of their money. And in defence terms, that really means a statement of the threats that we face in terms of a strategy, and then a plan for each one of those threats as to how to meet them, and then a decision as to how they're going to fund it. It is so similar to the Labor Party's plan for renewable energy. We've got no idea exactly what they want to do. We don't know when they're going to do it. We don't know how they're going to pay for it. We need to at least double our defence expenditure. I've spent a lot of time in Israel, and if the Israelis took the approach that we can never defend this country, defend their own country, with hundreds of millions of Arab nations around them who have fought war after war after war against them, yet 6 million Jewish Israelis and 2 million Arab Israelis have been dominant in that part of the world. I think we can defend this country, but we can't defend it with 60,000 full-time troops, 80,000 part-time troops. The issue that we've got at the moment is that following Vietnam, we've spent so much time telling our soldiers, sailors and airmen and women that they're fantastic, that we're starting to believe it. We have a defence force which has never been better for the kind of wars we've fought for the last 80 years. That is where we could choose when we go, what we take. We don't have to actually win the war, we just have to be there. We can choose when we come home. Well, those days are pretty well past. They might occur again, but it'll be subsidiary to the main strategic challenge, which is defence of liberal democracy in our part of the world with our American allies. Our defence force will hardly last a couple of days in a serious fight anywhere. We lack the lethality in our defence force. That's missiles and things like that. We lack sustainability. Our defence force doesn't have the reserves of people or of equipment, spare parts, ammunition to be sustainable. So we can't fight for long enough. And we lack mass. We're not big enough. We can probably handle one thing for a couple of days, then it's all over. Now, that's fantastic, because for the last 80 years we could get away with that, and we've been able to build hospitals and roads and other things by the money we've saved. But we've got to recognise those days have now gone. Governments have got to lead the people to expect increased defence expenditure.
Okay, so that's what, roughly 2% of GDP at the moment. Does that need to double up to 4? Is that
Absolutely,
what you're saying? Right.
At least, yes. And the way to get to that is that you start with a strategy. You say this is the range of threats, and each one of these threats needs to be met. Sometimes two of these threats might come at us at the same time. Can we meet those? My fear is that the government is going to say to the Defence Strategic Review, don't go above 2%. Stay at 2%. They might say it quietly. I asked in estimates, and I really didn't get a satisfactory answer. So that's what worries me more than anything else, that we will be presented with a solution which has got something to do with 2% of GDP.
Right, but I mean, all of this takes time.
Yes, it does.
To get new planes, new boats, new missiles,
Correct.
new weaponry.
Correct.
To build the troop levels. I mean, to get to 80,000 troops, isn't that the 2040 goal?
Yes, it is, but that's a joke. Absolute joke.
Way off in the distance.
Yeah. I mean that's fantasy land, that was those ideas of the 18,500 troops more by 2040 was in order to match the equipment which in peacetime we thought we were going to have in those days of peace.
So, Jim, when did this all start? Well, I mean, these shortages haven't just happened. They've been happening over time. Did you notice this?
Oh yes, I have been.
Back when you're in the battlefield?
Many of us in the military, over about the last 15 years or so, have well and truly seen that we were losing our conventional warfare capabilities. We never had much, but we were losing our conventional warfare capabilities. We were going off to the very small wars around the world, and that takes an awful lot of effort. There weren't many of us. Many of us went many times. So yes, we did notice it, and we tried to change it to the best of our ability, but no government was particularly interested in putting much money into defence. And I think of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, where we lost so much in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, where they took us back to about 1.6% of GDP, and the 0.4% of GDP that they saved money on, and Stephen Smith was the minister who is doing the review now, the 0.4% they saved on was all capability. So we didn't get what we needed, although it would still have been quite inadequate. We've got to change the mental set in Australia, in the government and in the people, totally. This is likely to happen so fast that we're not going to get there in time.
Taiwan, you mean?
Yeah, a Taiwan scenario, a 1944 style attack or some other way of achieving the strategic aims, that is getting Taiwan and getting rid of the Americans, is likely to happen so fast. We'll still be sitting in Sydney Harbour, or our aeroplanes will be sitting on their airfields somewhere in Australia. Yeah. China is not going to give us a year and a half's warning on this, as the Japanese and the Germans gave us in World War II. In fact, they've already given us warning. As you talk to any of the strategists around the place, we are well and truly within the strategic warning time for the next war. The Chinese in Western China rehearse sinking American aircraft carriers frequently.
Why'd you get into all of this, Jim? Why'd you become a senator?
Well, I care about Australia. I don't want to have lived. I was born in 1950. I don't want to have lived through the best part of Australia's existence, where post-World War II we were prosperous, we were sovereign, we were allied with the greatest country in the world. I want that to continue going forward for Australians. And the only way we can do it is by being strong enough to deter direct action against ourselves. I complained and whinged when I was in the army for any number of years. Once I got to a high level in the army, I would advocate for this and for that. No one was interested. No Liberal Party, coalition governments or Labor governments weren't interested. And I became involved in border protection, and we did border protection very, very well. And I was impressed by how effective we could be once we came up with a strategy. We came up with a strategy, and Scott Morrison credits me with to be a co-author of that strategy with him. We came up with a strategy and we just did it. This is the way we've got to approach our strategic environment. The Albanese government has got to come up with a strategy, figure it all out, and just do it and pay for it.
Regardless of whatever kind of blowback might come from the public?
Well, I think ultimately the public will come alongside. At the moment, no government is putting to them that we've got to significantly increase defence, and those that do say, oh yeah, China, yeah, but what does it mean? Okay, now is the time for real plans and real expenditure.